said, I do believe in God, because when you look at his universe, with its complexity, there must be that. Let me tell you another thing he did. Some of us could look pretty far in the future. I think it was John Adams who said that we might become a nation of 300 people spread to the Pacific. And at the time, we were 3 million people huddled on the eastern seaboard. That's an incredible leap of mind. Paine had a similar leap. He said, when you meet people from worlds other than our own, our common language will be mathematics. Now, when Carl Sagan said that the Voyagers, yes, I keep up, especially scientific stuff, I love science, that the Voyagers should contain a plaque which explained in mathematical terms who these humans were and where we lived, and the scale was the hydrogen atom, because no matter what civilization you find, their most common element will be hydrogen, because that's the nature of the universe. So if they could figure out that was a hydrogen atom, they could figure out next what we looked like. We had little drawings, how tall we were, because the scale was matched to the hydrogen atom, where we were located in what galaxy, and within that galaxy what solar system, and within that solar system which planet. All with mathematics. Now that made perfect sense when Dr. Carl Sagan suggested it in the 20th century. But imagine someone who could look far enough into the future to foresee that when you use a candle for your light and you used a quill pen to write. That is incredible. There were, I'll leave it to others to figure out whether I counted this group, but there were geniuses walking in the land when we wrote the Constitution. And many of us believe, but it's a private and a personal belief, that the hand of God was present when we did that. Gladstone, the Prime Minister of England, on the 100th anniversary of the Constitution said, this is the greatest work ever struck off by hand of man at one time. And it may be, and we may be about to lose it. That's the serious business. I can talk to you, I can urge you to read various things, but it's your business to protect the Constitution. Yes, sir.
Mr. Franklin.
Either works, or Ben.
I have a multiple question. Why didn't the framers put in something about term limits? And Mr. Franklin, what do you think about is appropriate for term limits?
Oh, we didn't put it in because it didn't seem necessary. Because in the culture of our day, it was a burden. First of all, just to get there, whether you were going to Springfield, Massachusetts, or New York, our first capital, or Annapolis, which was there for a brief time, etc. It was a burden just to go there and to function. And people did not tend to stay long. The century in which the incumbents had a 100% level of re-election was not the 20th, not the 21st, not the 19th. It was the 18th. The very second election for the House of Representatives, every single incumbent who ran for re-election was re-elected. But turnover that year was 30.2%, because that number of members of the House says, I don't want this, I'm going home. And that was my point. In our era, we didn't worry about term limits because people didn't stick around very long. There was no such thing as a professional politician in our day. And that is not a gain, that is a loss for the United States to get professional politicians. Because that automatically cuts off the politicians who are permanent. I mean, the ones who get out of college, go to law school, from law school, become a prosecutor, from being a prosecutor to become a state representative, and then they work their way up to, oh, well, let's pick something just out of the air. Vice President of the United States and a few votes away from being president. You know who I'm talking about? Al Gore. He spent his whole career in public, quote-unquote, service. Now, the trouble with that is not that service is a bad idea, but that people who live inside the government for that period of time lose touch with, lose understanding with, lose sympathy with, lose association with the people who sent them into government in the first place. So, as far as what do I favor as term limits? Well, I'm Ben, but this gentleman, John Armour, I've heard about. And he wrote a book entitled, Why Term Limits? Because They Have It Coming. And it discusses that subject. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court case, which would have established term limits in Arkansas and several other states for Congress, was struck down by the Supreme Court on a 5-4 vote. I'm getting out of character a bit. I advised the lawyer who argued that he had to use history as the example. Because there was one member of the Supreme Court who had spent her entire public career working on legal rights for women. And she knew the history of suffrage for women, which was established by constitutional amendment, inside and out. And I told him, you've got to go straight at that first female justice. Excuse me, she wasn't the first, she was the second. And point out that the voting rights for women were established the same way that the people who supported term limits are trying to do it. They did it state by state by state by state, until there were enough members of Congress who were depending on women's votes or they wouldn't be in Congress, so that it finally, a decade later, passed through Congress. But if it hadn't been able to be established at the state level first, there would have been, you know, like opening a paint can. You just got to get the lip up at one point, and then you just work your way around. And if he had assaulted Justice Ginsburg directly by pointing out the absolute analogy between the way we got voting rights for women and the way we were trying to establish term limits for members of Congress, she might have been forced, whether she didn't like it or not, forced not to vote her ideology, but to vote history and law. And if so, that case would have been won. But bottom line, it seems to me, when you look at what has been done at the state level, and it seems to me that 6 years in the House, that means 3 terms is enough, and 2 terms in the Senate, which is 12 years. And that would, well, of course, anybody who's been in the military knows it's up or out. At a certain point, if you don't get promoted, it's time for you to retire and become a truck driver or something, because you can't stay. And that's, and that promotes what Tom Jefferson said was the aristocracy of merit, which means if you have qualities, you continue to move up. And if you don't have qualities, instead of stagnating in one position, I mean, the stuff about Senator Byrd of West Virginia serving for a millennium and a half in the Senate of the United States. It's interesting as a curiosity, it's a bit of a freak show. But what does it say about the government of the United States? That someone who first went into the Senate shortly after the Korean War ended and Eisenhower was president of the United States, who is still there today? Not much. Fossilization does not happen merely to ancient animals that fall into tar pits.